In this lecture video, we will look at Aristotle's Politics, Book 7, and what Aristotle actually argues is the ideal form of government. So remember, Aristotle thinks of the natures of things into four causes: a material cause, a formal cause, an efficient cause, and a final cause. So speaking of a city, about politics in particular, the material cause of a city will be a particular population in a given territory, right? So the kinds of land, the kinds of resources, and the kinds of people. Its formal cause will be its constitution. Its efficient cause will be those in charge of ruling, depending on the kind of form of government, would be, maybe a particular ruler, different forms of politicians, and so on. And then the final cause, right, the purpose of a city, in this case, right, the ideal city would be the good life or eudaimonia, although, depending on what kind of government it is, what kind of constitution, can affect on the basis of what kind of purpose that government has. Now, to return to that question posed by Aristotle, the fundamental question of politics is this normative problem. Right? So what constitutional form should the lawgiver establish and preserve in what material for the sake of what end? So in one kind of a bit clunky question, we get all the aspects of the four causes. And that is exactly what we're going to see Aristotle's answer is to that question. Again, what constitutional form should the lawgiver establish and preserve in what material for the sake of what end? Well, looking at the question of the purpose of government, the final cause, we know that the final cause for human beings, if we've read the Nicomachean Ethics, the purpose of existence for human beings is to flourish, is to excel in the virtues, to live a happy life characterized by eudaimonia. So, the best way of life for a person and for cities, then, is one equipped with virtue. So it won't be one that is maybe equipped with power, absolute sovereignty, or some of those other things that are really the focus of later political philosophers, like in the early modern tradition, and so on. And this leads Aristotle to argue that virtue is actually more important for a good life, and in particular for a city, in this case, than external things. So he says, people do not acquire and safeguard the virtues by means of external things, but the latter by means of the former, and that living happily, whether this is found by human beings in enjoyment or in virtue or both, belongs to a greater extent to those who have set in order their character and thinking to the utmost, are moderate about the acquisition of external goods, than to those who have acquired more of the latter than they have any use for, but come up short with the former. And we can really think this, or we can really understand this to mean that in speaking of the purpose of government, why then it actually is to enable the flourishing of the virtues, why it is aiming at virtue, why a good government is a virtuous government, and not necessarily one that is all-powerful, not necessarily one that is focused on security first and foremost, for example, security, order, and those kinds of things that maybe like political realists are more interested in. But it's virtue because virtue is the only way in which that form of government can be self-sustaining. So if you want order, you need the people, right, to be constituted such that they don't need external forces, such as constant punishments to get them to behave. You want them to actually understand why they ought to follow the law, why they ought to pursue the good life, as opposed to constantly needing the government to come in, right, and say, look, if you don't do right things, you're going to be punished. Only then, Aristotle is going to argue here, is a virtuous government one that is best able actually to secure order, to secure, to have security, to pursue profit and all those other kinds of external goods. But if you set up a government focused on those external goods first and foremost, it will not be sustainable. So again, the final cause of government, the purpose of government, is to enable the flourishing of the virtues for its citizens. But what about the material cause of the best possible city? Well, Aristotle says that you have to focus on the underlying material conditions of the city first. That means two things in terms of, the kind of territory, right? You need a territory that enables self-sufficiency, such that, it's easily defendable. It's not subject to easy invasion or attack by others. But you also need a kind of territory that will enable leisure. Perhaps then, you can actually grow crops and be able to feed yourselves. You also need a port for trade, but not one that allows an influx of foreigners. As we'll see in a moment, Aristotle argues you need a uniformity of culture. Now, you need a certain quantity of persons. So you need a mean of extremes in terms of the population so that the city is self-sufficient. If you have too few individuals, self-sufficiency is impossible because you're not going to have enough people that are able to perform all the tasks required in maintaining a city, right? If you only have a city of 100 people, you might have all of, let's say, maybe the most basic things secured, but maybe you don't have those other things like, perhaps you have, carpenters and farmers and things like that, and a couple, warriors. But you're not going to have then, teachers and maybe engineers and maybe, doctors and those other kinds of things that require then more people to, be farmers and provide the material resources for other people to pursue those kinds of disciplines, those kinds of professions. If you have too many people, then Aristotle says, for law is a certain kind of ordering, and being under good law is necessarily a well-ordered condition. But a number that is too excessive is incapable of forming part of an order. Too many people, the society becomes unruly. So you need a mean of extremes in terms of population. Besides quantity of persons, you need a certain quality of persons. You need a kind of people that are a mean between thoughtfulness, those who are intellectually inclined, but also kind of spiritedness. You need those who then are going to be well suited for defending the city, have courage. Aristotle thinks that, actually the Greeks are the perfect kind of people that have this kind of quality for the best, ideal form of government. Of course, this is Aristotle being biased, again, as is common for Aristotle. Now, to that point about the need for a uniformity of culture. So Aristotle says, a city is an association of people who are alike, for the sake of the best life they are capable of. And since the best thing is happiness, and this is the being at work of virtue, and some complete way of putting it into practice, and it so happens that some people are capable of sharing in it, while others have little or no capacity, it is clear that this is the reason why more than one form of city and variety of government arises. For since each group hunts for this in a different way, and by different means, this produces different ways of life and forms of government. If then you have so many different people that are in the habit of performing and living according to different ways of life, you will have strife within the city, a city set against itself, living on the basis of different forms of government, when in fact you cannot have one city that is made up of different forms of government. At least not a city that rules well and sustains itself well. Now for the formal cause of the best city, which is ultimately the constitution of a city. Earlier, we saw that Aristotle argued that in terms of the right definition of citizenship, it is one who has a right to share in the deliberative and judicial rule of any state. Right? So it can't be slaves, it can't be children, potentially it could be women according to Aristotle, and whether we want to endorse his arguments about why men are superior to women. Hopefully we don't endorse those arguments. But his point is basically like, look, you need those who are in charge of ruling or electing those who rule to be people who have the capacity to recognize who would be right to rule, who have a certain level of, we could say, intellectual wisdom as well as practical wisdom, especially practical wisdom when it comes to ruling. This is related to Aristotle's claim that citizens shouldn't be laborers, and this might be a shock to us. What do you mean citizens can't be laborers? In fact, most people that constitute a society are laborers, right? The working class is the majority of society. But Aristotle argues that a good citizen needs leisure both for the formation of virtue and for the political activities, right? You need the requisite time to be able to study the arts, to be able to study philosophy, and all those other things that enable one to develop both virtues of character and the intellectual virtues. And you also need one who's able to study and get engaged in politics. And if you can only sustain yourself by working for a wage, you won't have the requisite leisure time necessary to achieve these things. Now, this actually isn't such an uncommon argument. If you go back to someone like go back in time, but someone that came later than Aristotle, Immanuel Kant, he argued that only citizens should only be those who own property, because people that own property aren't subject to the will of others or the influence of others, because they're self-sustaining, they're self-sufficient people, and therefore can be trusted to govern for the sake of truth and what is right. And in fact, this was a common idea in the early formation of the United States, that to be truly free, you had to own property. Because only when you own your own property are you therefore not subject to the will of others. Let me read here Aristotle's further justification for this point. The citizens need to live a life that is devoted neither to the mechanical trades nor to the trade of the marketplace. For a life of that sort is ill-bred and not conducive to virtue. Indeed, those who are going to be citizens ought not to be farmers either, since they need leisure both for the formation of virtue and for political activities. Now, as with private property, he argues that it must exist for the people to do their jobs that contribute to the well-being of the city. But that doesn't mean then private property exists for the maximization of profit, as we've seen earlier. The structure of class in the best possible city would be such that at the top you have rulers or citizens, depending on the form of government. Perhaps you have, more democratic form, more monarchical form, or an aristocratic form, as Aristotle endorses, as we'll see. Second class would be warriors, but depending on the kind of constitution, it might be that the warriors are also the rulers, and it also can be the case that warriors are also citizens. So sometimes the first and second classes, the distinction gets blurred. Then the third class would be laborers, and of course the fourth and final, slaves. He also argues that property should not be held in common, so it shouldn't be, in a sense, maybe we would say like communist, but property should be common in use. So he says, we claim property ought not to be held in common the way some have said, and here he's referencing the claim in Plato's Republic, but ought to become common in use as among friends, and none of the citizens ought to be in need of food. As for common meals, everyone agrees it is useful to have them in cities that are set up well. We shall say later why we agree with this too. And all the citizens ought to take part in them. But it is not easy for the needy to contribute a prescribed portion from their own resources and still provide for the rest of their households. And expenses that have to do with the gods are also a common responsibility of the whole city. It is necessary then to divide the land into two parts, and for one to be common, while the other is made up of private estates, and to divide each of these in two again, which is not uncommon. We have public land and private land. But then he says, right, so we ought to divide each of these into two again. So of the common land, we divide into two. One part ought to be devoted to public services connected with the gods, and the other to the expense of the common meals. And of the land made up of private estates, then, the two parts of the private estates would be, one part ought to be near the outlying area, and the other near the town, so that everyone will have a stake in both places, with two allotments apportioned to each. Doing things this way has features of equality and justice, and is more conducive to like-mindedness about border wars. So there are certain underlying conditions that are required in order to facilitate the realization of the happy life, enable to have the flourishing of the virtues in the ideal city. And Aristotle says, hence, for the organization of the city to be as we wish in matters of which luck is in control, is merely a matter of wishing. For we assign the control of what is already present to luck. But for the city to be excellent, stature is no longer a product of luck, but of knowledge and choice. So where a city is formed, to some extent, is historically and organically a matter of luck. But once we start to learn what it is that makes a city function properly, we begin to have the knowledge of whether to further the growth of a city or to perhaps further the growth of another city or have one decay and start a new one. A city is excellent when happiness is realized, and happiness is the being at work and putting to use of complete virtue, and this not in any conditional sense, but preconditionally. So you need certain underlying conditions that enable education, as well as opportunities in politics, Aristotle thinks, in order for people to become good and excellent by the means of nature, habit, and reason. And only when you have citizens that have become good and excellent by these means are you going to have the proper kind of constitution of a city. So citizens should be educated by means of habits and reason, such that you structure the city such that it operates in a certain way and it ends up coming naturally, but also it is designed according to a rational plan, each in consonant with the other. You want habits to reach unconditional virtue, and you want reason then to inform and guide habits. So you want your rulers to be educated to best enact what reason can determine is appropriate. The legislator, Aristotle argues, needs to make laws about marriage to ensure procreation takes place at the best time to produce the best citizens. So perhaps you have, of course, certain laws about when maybe people can marry and who they can marry. Maybe they shouldn't, be marrying brother and sister, for example. Education also, since it is so important to the cultivating of virtue of the citizens and making excellent rulers, it should be regulated. Aristotle says, it benefits their souls to begin instilling habits right from when they are small children, since this is of the utmost usefulness both for healthy and for military activities. So, in this sense, education is political, because it is a matter of whether or not you produce excellent citizens, and only excellent citizens are going to enable a city to be self-sustaining and complete. So Aristotle says here, in a little bit of a lengthy passage that I will read. So in the first stage, it is beneficial for attention to be given to this sort of thing, and to matters closely related to this. And at the age next after this one, up to 5 years, during which it is not a beautiful idea ever to draw them toward any sort of learning or toward necessary work, so as not to impede their growth. They ought to get enough exercise to keep their bodies from being idle, which one should provide for them by means of play as well as other activities. And their forms of play ought not to be unsuited to free people, and neither burdensome nor lax. As for the sorts of stories and tales children of this age ought to hear, let that be a concern for those officials people call overseers of children. For all such things ought to prepare the way for their later pursuits, which is why many forms of play ought to be imitations of things that will be serious concerns later on. But those in the Laws, a dialogue written by Plato, who prevent children from straining and bawling are not right to forbid these things, because they are beneficial to their growth. For they turn out in a certain way to be exercises for their bodies. For holding one's breath produces strength for people who do work, which results also for children who strain their lungs. And the way they spend their time needs to be looked into by the overseers of children, especially to see that they will be among slaves as little as possible. For at this age and up to 7 years, it is a necessity for them to have their rearing at home. So it is reasonable to expect that even at such an age, they will be getting the influence of a slavish attitude from the things they hear and see. So the lawgiver needs to banish filthy language from the city entirely, as he would anything else. For from easily speaking of any shameful thing, one comes to do something like it. It ought then to be banished especially from among the young, so they will not say or hear any such thing. And if anyone openly says or does anything that is forbidden, a free person who is not yet considered worthy of reclining at the common meals should be punished with the deprivation of honors and with beatings, and one older than that age, for his slavish behavior, with the loss of the honors due a free person. So some of this you can see, I think, why Aristotle regards certain levels of education of what you learn. And in particular, the study of politics shouldn't be something studied until one has already entered adulthood. And now to the efficient cause, the question of who actually should rule government. What is the best possible form of government? And Aristotle argues, not democracy, it's not oligarchy, it's aristocracy. And it's aristocracy because aristocracy is ruled by the meritorious. So he doesn't mean aristocracy like we might think in the Middle Ages of, it's ruled by those, the lords, the noble people who are born into it, which is broken up by class in that way. So it's as much economic as it is political. He means aristocracy as a rule by those who are worthy, in a sense. Worthy morally, not worthy by political nobility or things like that. We've already seen some of his arguments from book 3 as to why democracy is unstable, why oligarchy is unstable, why a monarchy, would be, as well as potentially democracy, the ideal form of government, but it's extremely unlikely to find one individual who basically is so wise they could just effectively tell us to do whatever without any checks and balances. So it's not the best possible form of government. And democracy, of course, would be if everybody was educated appropriately. But that's not the case. He thinks you have to have certain kind of different levels of education that meet different kinds of needs. And so aristocracy is the best form of government, that those who are most moral deserve the most to rule over us, and it's for our own benefit. Well, I say rule over us, maybe I or you would be worthy as well. But you have the most moral because they're going to rule for the sake of the good, not for their own personal benefit. They're going to have the proper practical wisdom to be the best kind of a ruler. So, in a way, theoretically, it would seem to make sense as to what Aristotle is arguing. So he argues the job of an excellent lawgiver is to study how an association of human beings can participate in a good life and in the happiness that is possible for them. Well, that would be to study the politics, what he has taught here. And so it is necessary for everyone who merits such an honor to take turns ruling. So you might have an aristocracy where you would have a kind of like semi-democracy where only a few people rule, or maybe this would really be a kind of form of more of a republic than a democracy, although the vote would be democratic. So it can take different forms, but Aristotle clearly thinks then all those who are worthy of ruling should take turns then ruling. Now, I think Aristotle's argument about why an aristocracy would be the best possible form of government, we could just refer to it as maybe a moral aristocracy. Maybe that's a more intuitive name. I think living in a democracy, it seems strange, if not ridiculous, if not corrupt, if not a sign of how unfree the majority are, to say, well, only those who are worthy of ruling should rule, as opposed to all people who are citizens being able to elect their own leaders. But we do know there are issues with whether or not the populace knows who really is the best leader. And we know the ways in which rhetoric can influence people's decisions in electing politicians. We know how the media, social media, money in politics influences how people, who people vote for and how people rule. So is there merit to Aristotle's argument that aristocracy is the best form of government? Should those best suited to rule instead of those democratically voted to rule?